Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the Introduction to Forensic Science Week 5 Google Hangout, coming to you live from the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. Today we will be putting your questions to Dr. Bill Tilston, discussing weeks 4 and 5 of the course, which covered drugs of abuse, footwear and tumor compression evidence. Please feel free to ask questions using the Google Hangout question box, and we will do our best to pass along as many of your questions as we can. Don't forget, you can also post your questions on Twitter using the hashtag FLForensic. And now, without further ado, I will hand over to Dr. Tilston, who will be hosting today's Google Hangout.
It's okay. I wasn't speaking. I just thought after the last one and the sound problems we had, I would have a wee laugh to get it started off. Right, we've got a bunch of questions from you covering the 2 weeks, some really good ones, and some opportunities actually to bring you up to date with some of the threads that we're running through the discussions for those 2 weeks. The first question I want to deal with, and it's one that several of you have posted on, and it's one that was dealt with extensively in the threads, and that's this vexed question of Mr. or Mrs. Ward's mobile phone. Essentially, as we've said a few times, what we tried to do here was replicate in the actual offence what happened in the real case as closely as we could. But the real case was the mid-80s, and they didn't have mobile phones then. So we did not give Mr. Ward the luxury of being able to use a mobile phone to do whatever he wanted to do following the shootings. As time went on, and as you saw in week 1 in the scene video, when we updated it and when Mr. Duggan appeared to help things out, he did have a mobile phone and we let him use that at that point to contact the police. So that's why, no, Mr. Ward didn't use a mobile phone. We set it up that way quite deliberately to try and mimic the real case, but we then got up to date. We skipped 40 years with what happened after that. And of course, as you've said, and many of you raised the point, if we had have allowed Mr. Ward to have a mobile phone, it just makes life so easier. There are so many questions that can be answered from following these devices, either triangulation to put people at a particular location or accessing the phone records to see who called whom, when and where. So sorry, but that's that one. Robert Hart, who asked that, also asked one that we dealt with last week, but given all joking aside, it's last week did have its problems, I'd like just to pick it up again. And he wants to know why we can explain why it is that mitochondrial DNA remains, and he quotes, unchanged, end quote, over generations, and what does it mean exactly? Well, basically, we didn't say it remained unchanged over generations. What we said was, if you look at a dead body and the remains, even a dead body that's been there for years or decades or centuries, the mitochondrial DNA in the body is resistant to degradation over those long periods of time. It's not so much that it's intrinsically stable, but rather so much of it present in the body compared to the amount that's in the nucleus that there's pretty well always going to be enough found in reasonable circumstances to analyse. But the mitochondrial DNA itself does change. It does change with generations. It does undergo mutation, just like anything else does. So I hope that answers the question for you there, Robert. Again, just to repeat, the issue is mitochondrial DNA is a terrific resource for looking at remains because there's so much of it in the body, so you're pretty well always going to get enough there that you can analyse and get information about the identity of the deceased. The next question I want to deal with came from Edward Devlin. And Edward, like many of you in the threads, is concerned about using gunshot residue analysis to get information in this case. And you're quite right in a generic sense. It is possible to get a lot of useful information from gunshot residue analysis, from clothing and from hands and face in an event. But there are limitations to it. And there are two main limitations that we talked about in the thread, and I want to go over again for you. The first of these is in any shooting situation, gunshot residues, they're fine particles, they get in your hand, they get in your clothing. And not only do they get on, they fall off. And practically, well, to my knowledge, I don't know of any lab anywhere in the world that would accept items for examination for GSRs that are more than 6 hours, were taken more than 6 hours after the event, because they just fall off. So you're not going to get anything worthwhile. And if you add to that the kind of philosophical point that we made a couple of times, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. So that's a restriction. The other, well, let me finish that, add a wee bit to that. The one case where gunshot residues are really, really valuable is in civil law rather than criminal law, where a coroner's investigating whether a death by shooting is truly a suicide. And in those cases, what the investigators do, they go in, they get the hands of the person, bag them up before the body's moved, and when it gets to the mortuary, you then take it open the bag and swab down the hand for gunshot residues. That'll tell you reasonably comfortably and with a reasonable degree of certainty whether the person did fire a gun or not. That's a fairly limited and unique set of circumstances. The second restriction, which is kind of the reverse of these particles falling off the body, is these were shootings. Two people were shot, and either inside or around a car with the door open. That's been clear from day one in the case story. So it's going to be gunshot residues all over the place. So if you find some on Mr. Ward's hands, what does it tell you? It tells you he's got gunshot residues in his hands, maybe because he clutched his arm where he was shot, maybe because he reached over to see to Mrs. Ward where she was shot, maybe because he picked them up from the environment. So what we've tried to do in the discussions on this is tease out for you this kind of the elements in this spectrum from what's science, what's investigation, what's intelligence information to help to put together what happened in the crime. And the science here is yes, we can identify gunshot residues with rock solid certainty. But what does it tell you? Sometimes, and a lot of times, the answer to that's going to be not a lot, maybe kind of weak corroboration at the best. And that's always got to be borne in mind when you're thinking about what to do from the point of view of will this stand up in court as evidence that helps to reconstruct the events and lead the jury either to he was guilty or he was innocent. However, separate from that, there's nothing at all wrong with the lab doing this work and then going to the investigators and saying, well, you know, we had a look at this. We can't stand up and swear beyond all reasonable doubt that this is so, but this is the kind of thing that we would quite often see in these circumstances, and it might help the investigators to develop a lead and work out where they're going to go next. Now, Edward also wanted to go back a little bit to the week before last, and he brought up this question again of DNA from the scene of a man who's had a vasectomy. I'm not quite sure, Edward, how you related that to our case, but anyway, it's a very legitimate question. It was one that we dealt with in the last hangout, but again, given the problems we had with the sound and the validity of the question in its own right, I'd like to just take a minute or two to deal with it. Edward says, pretty well accurately, obviously there are no spermatozoa present. In fact, you sometimes do get very, very low levels leak through even after a vasectomy. But it doesn't matter. There's enough other nuclear material there, cells that are shed from the lining of the various tracts that the seminal fluid passes through, for example. And there's enough there to get a PCR reaction and identify where the male seminal fluid came from. Now, Valerie Keston-Hole is interested in the tyre and foot marks. What she wants to know is, did we get any of that sort of evidence at the cottage where the drugs lab was that could have shown that the wards may have been there? And also, she was concerned that we didn't have any more information corroborating what the waiter witnessed and the timing of it. And of course, a lot of you posted questions and comments about apparent timing conflicts. And again, my standard response to that was almost, well, do you know what you were doing at 3:30 3 Sundays ago? And unless you were doing something special, some reason why you knew exactly what time it was, then no, you don't. You can recollect what you did in the afternoon 3 Sundays ago, but it's not going to be very precise about exactly when it was in most cases. And what you saw in the reconstruction there was deliberate, and it was trying to reflect this uncertainty that you have to deal with in real life. But that's why there's not anything else confirming what the waiter witnessed in the timing. The question about tire marks at the location of the cottage, no, we deliberately left that out of the case. We felt that we had enough really good examples of good foot marks, or good footwear marks, and not so good footwear marks, and some really pretty good tyre marks from the loch side that illustrated what we wanted to do in that module about how to collect impression evidence and the value of impression evidence, and this issue of the difference between class characteristics and individualising characteristics. And I might come back to those later on with another question. Oh, here come the police. Right, they've given up, they're innocent, they've gone away. Faith Fletcher and many others of you want the detectives to go through the ward financial records and hope they'll come across something. It might have been a drug deal gone wrong and a robbery story was just a blind. Fair comment, absolutely fair comment, but again, like we've said in response to similar things, we have restricted this course to forensic science, and forensic science in, I've come back, I give up. Right, forensic science in the context of what we wanted to tell you about these main areas of DNA, of crime scene reconstruction, of impression evidence, and of drugs. So we just didn't put it in, quite honestly. There's no other reason for it. That's why we just didn't put it in. Now, Susan Starson had a question again, and we've dealt with it earlier, with how long does gunshot residue persist? Does it last longer in clothing on the hands? Is it removed by normal washing? It's removed very, very easily by normal washing. And whether it lasts longer in clothing than hands depends what kind of clothing. I've got a fairly loose knit woolly jumper on, and it would kind of get trapped in the fabric of this for a bit longer than it would in my hands if I fired a gun. But it's still 6 hour limit, so not long. Now, Therese, who's asked a few questions and been an avid poster of very good comments throughout all 5 weeks so far, she was asking about the bank accounts too. She was asking about who fired the gun and who owned it. The answer is we don't know and we don't know. And she was also curious about Duggan's false identity. Why didn't he take his driver's license? I think, and she said, I think not quite sure what she meant. Or was his driver's license taken then? I think not. No, it wasn't. And that, from the point, again, that was an artifice that we put in to help to focus what we're doing on the forensic science aspects. In a real event, of course, the police officers at the scene would have asked for that, and all of this other stuff wouldn't have happened. But then we wouldn't have been able to build in this investigative part where we were looking for fingerprints, identifying them, searching the databases, and coming up with leads somewhere else. So those of you, and there's a lot of you in this class, who are either are or would be crime fiction writers and want to incorporate forensic science into it, just that's a wee cautionary tale for you. Don't forget the real life stuff too. George Hull wants to know, why has there been no mention of anyone who may have heard the noise of 2 bullets being fired? Because, well, there's actually 2 reasons, and these are very realistic reasons. It was down at the loch side. The priory itself is a fairly solid building. If the doors were shut and the windows were shut and it was that distance away and it was a handgun, probably wouldn't have heard them. But if the doors were open and the wind was in the right direction, you might have heard them. But it's also a place where there's shooting for hunting takes place. so it might not have been too surprising. Now, William Baker's actually got a very good question. He wants to know what being in the water since the murder would do to DNA or finger marks in the gun. And the short answer to that is, whatever you would like. Anything in water, the water is going to degrade it, particularly if there's any motion, tides, winds, water lapping. Anything, particularly the finger marks where it's in sweat and is water soluble, these wouldn't last forever, absolutely not. And that with them would also go the DNA because it's in the same place as the finger marks. So any reasonable length of time in water will remove this sort of evidence. But what's the reasonable length of time depends on what kind of water, salt water, fresh water, how much movement there is. But yes, they could get lost. He also wants to know if Mr. Ward was tested for gunshot residues. We've dealt with that. And we've asked how easy it is to get rid of mass gunshot residues. And it's easy, we've dealt with that too. Just get rid of your clothes and wash your hands and there you go. Now, Shirley Buckingham asked a question. Looking forward to tonight's hangout. We're looking forward to your participation too, Shirley. You were asked how evidence bags are kept, and is there a certain way to put evidence into the bags so that the outside of the bag is not touched, so as not to contaminate the evidence? I guess when you say the outside of the bag is not touched, you mean if somebody put drugs into it, they wouldn't touch the outside of the bag when they were putting it in. I take it you don't actually mean the people touching it. The answer is actually quite simple. The bags are quite large, and if you open them up, you can certainly put solid dosage form drugs, tablets or capsules in quite easily. You can put vegetable matter, cannabis in quite easily without any outside contamination. And if it's a powder seizage, usually a white powder thing, what quite often happens is it's double bagged. So it goes into a bag and then that bag itself goes into the evidence bag. But the evidence bags themselves are very, very robust to leakage. And really, they've got sort of layers that you can open them up through, which prevents any contamination from one opening to the next opening. Gail Williams wants to know if there's a global register of illegal drugs that could possibly be available, and does the UK Drug Enforcement Office communicate with the DEA in the USA? The answer to this is the same for all of them. Yes, very much so. There's a lot of cooperation between jurisdictions, between countries, between forces, and between global entities like Interpol and like the UN on what's fashionable, what's happening with drugs, who's finding what, where, what new synthetic pathways are coming through. The UN, for example, has got an office in Vienna that deals just exactly with this sort of information. So there's not a global register per se, but there's a very substantial network of cooperation between bodies takes place. Now, Wendy, the last question I've got here is Wendy was curious about whether, in fact, we've got free crime as such. In essence, we do, and we've got a drugs lab, we've got a link to a gangland murder, but from the point of view of our case, there's only the one thing, and that's what's happened at the Lochside or on the road to Ross Priory, what's happened with the shooting of Mr. Ward, what's happened with the shooting of Mrs. Ward. So, yes, there are three as such, and we put that in, again, partly as a device to help us put together something that covered the evidence areas that we wanted, but it does also illustrate very real life. A lot of situations, people involved in drugs cases, they go around under lots of different names, and if you look for records for Mr. Smith, apart from the fact there's a lot of Smiths, you might miss what you're looking for because the person might have used Mr. Jones as his name in that case. So again, that was one of the reasons why we put that, all the different names into that part of the case. Now, one thing, we've kind of dealt with the ones that have come in through the website so far, the questions, but what I'd like to do is just take a couple of minutes and go back to something that we talked about in week 4, not the drugs week, the impressions evidence thing. A lot of you seemed concerned that there wasn't a lot of value in the footwear and tire mark impression evidence because it was only class characteristics and it wasn't going to tell us anything. And as I said in the comments to the poll then, by an overwhelming majority, you all wanted to go for gunshot residues. And again, as I posted, that wasn't, in my view, the best response to this. And the reasons are, yes, the gunshot residues are specific in the sense that if you identify them, that's what it is nowadays. The technology we use is gunshots and nothing else. But as explained at the beginning of this hangout, although that's fact, what the evidential value, the reliability of the conclusions that you can draw from it is, well, it's really not very good. You probably, or you may well have been tempted to go for, I don't really want, or I don't really like the footwear and tire track evidence because it came after finger marks. And those marks, which are impression evidence too, that you get from finger pads, if you've got a good match, despite all of the controversies that are going on just now, it really is, it's terrific evidence about identity and is, by any reasonable definition of the word, individualising. But there's a tremendous amount of useful intelligence information in footwear and tire mark evidence to help people to locate, to associate the likelihood of, or the possibility of that car being somewhere other than where it was first found. Some of you asked, you posted in the comments, there's something fishy here. That car's parked nicely at the side of the road. That's too neat. And we now know that it was too neat because that's not where the offence took place. But it took that information about somebody seeing the car drive in the direction of the lock. Nobody said they saw it actually down at the lock side, plus that footwear evidence and that tire mark evidence to say, that car has been there and it was there before it got to the roadside on the access road from the main highway into Ross Priory. So don't dismiss class characteristics. They can produce extremely valuable information. Don't dismiss either and this has been difficult for me in the discussions we've had, not to give too much away. Don't dismiss either the validity of intuition in all this. We're going to talk a lot about that next week. And maybe you were right, those of you whose intuition said, well, must have been the husband. No, it's always the husband that done it in all the stories that we've seen and we've looked at. Yes, not a bad thing to have in the back of your mind. But what concerned me a little bit in a lot of the postings was that thing seems to be at the forefront of the mind of a lot of you rather than the back of it. Perfectly reasonable to have it there and use that as the starting point for some framework inside which you're going to conduct and interpret your forensic science evidence. But remember, back to my favourite Sherlock quote, you've got to get it the right way around. You're not looking for evidence that fits that. What you're looking for is, what does the evidence tell you? And then take that evidence tells me something, how does that fit with what my intuition is or what any other explanations were for what happened? I'm going to pick up another theme that I think inevitably developed and kept running and wouldn't go away in the drugs module. and that is this whole one about should we decriminalise drugs? Is it really a crime? Is it a medical problem? What about tobacco and alcohol? They're way, way worse. And as you know, for those of you who've been following, my stock response to that has always been this module, the week 5 module, is about identifying drugs to see whether someone has broken the law, because there are laws about possession and trading in controlled substances. And it's also, forensic science has also been about intelligence. Can we find out the mechanism that's used to synthesize the drugs that we've picked up, and can we relate these syntheses to a particular place where they were made, or to give a thread that shows batches are related to each other and were probably made at the same time, or seizures probably come from the same manufacturer batch. That's what forensic science is about. That's where it begins, and essentially that's where it ends. So I've tried to move you away from any discussions about isn't alcohol worse, isn't tobacco just as bad, and why don't they decriminalise it. I did post to one of you in response a reference, and those of you who didn't see it, you might like to do an internet search for Professor Nutt, N-U-T-T. And the reason I'm telling you that is, again, one of the things that Jim and I have tried to get over in all of this is that the whole of forensic science is permeated by this idea that it's objective evidence. It's giving you information that's got some reasonably solid foundation. And the link between that and where I'm going to with Professor Nutt is that he held a high government position in the part of government that was responsible for drugs, medical drugs and abused drugs. And he got the boot, to put it bluntly, for saying that he didn't believe that some of the legislation controlling drugs was justified by the evidence. So, you know, your questions have got a degree of validity in them. If you'd asked me, is there an evidence base for suggesting that there needs to be changes in things, then my answer to that would be, well, there is evidence around. It's not part of this course. I'm not going to talk about it, but if you want to, you can certainly go and look it up. The next point I'd like to come to, or question that was asked, is one that Aidan will talk about too in the closing session. Someone asked, or one of you said, I'm going to get up early on Monday and come in, and I'm going to go straight to the reveal to find out who done it, and then I'll go through the boring stuff about going through the content of that week. Well, we have got bad news for you. The reveal page, which is the same one as you've been getting for the poll results, will not be open until 4 o'clock? 4:30 on Friday the 13th. Now, some of you might think Friday the 13th is another clue in the case. It's not. The poll is up to you. But where I want to bring what I've just been talking about with evidence-based decisions and the slightly tongue-in-cheek but true request about can we get to go straight to the reveal. What we're going to ask you to do in the coming week is, at the end of all the material when we've gone through it, is vote whether you think Mr. Ward is guilty as charged or not. I'm going to ask you two things. Please do vote in this. We'd like to see as many responses as possible. And please cast your vote according to your analysis of the evidence. We take you through, or we give you the opportunity to work through this coming week, a logical system for collecting the information, analysing it, classifying it as testimonial or real. Please do that. And when you come to cast your vote based on what you think the evidence tells you, not whether you think Mr. Ward did it or not, because somebody else looks more shifty, or because, as I said earlier, it's always the husband that done it in these things. just digging up a couple of other ones. A lot of you have asked questions about cannabis and hemp and whether there are different species of cannabis, some of which are have more THC in them than others. And we've quite a lot of backwards and forwards in the threads about it. And I'd like just to take a few minutes to run through what those is the essence of those questions and responses on the thread. The first one is, and I got chastised for being too academic with one of you for this, but facts are facts. When we're talking about what is cannabis, we're talking about botany, and botany's got its own structure and its own naming structure and a tree of going from specifics to generics. And Cannabis sativa is the species, and everything that we call cannabis is in that species, Cannabis sativa. But there are varieties within that, and those varieties are questions you've asked about different kinds of cannabis are actually varieties within Cannabis sativa. And if you looked at it in a serious botanical context, they would actually talk about Cannabis sativa, var, whatever version it was. They also came up against this ambiguity about what hemp is. And hemp is an ordinary common and garden name that's very often used as being synonymous with cannabis. But it's also specifically the name for the cordage or the fibres in the cannabis plant stems that are used to make cordage and also used to make clothing. Choose the words very carefully here. I don't want you to go away and get the wrong impression. My daughter lives in a little country town in Western Australia, and there's a shop in the main street called the Hemp Shop. And it's not where all the locals go to buy their brownies or their green stuff. It's actually a clothing shop, and it sells various clothing and other fabric items that are made, woven from hemp. And they're not all rough things like cordage or like bags or sacks or something. I've got a couple of t-shirts that I bought there that are actually extremely soft and very easy to wear. So those of you who are asking questions, and a lot of you were Australian in fact, about this is a shame that such a focus on cannabis and such that people are so frightened of cannabis that they're making it difficult for legitimate growers to grow hemp for legitimate uses and use a very easy, cheap, natural green resource. And you've maybe got some point in that. One thing, we've just got a couple of minutes left, and one thing I'd like to do just to close that we strenuously avoided doing in the last hangout is just talk a little bit about the case. And again, this is trying to set you up using the word set you up in a very positive way, not no negative connotations, about where we are just now, ready for your analysis of the evidence and before you vote and give your verdict in the case. Some of you seem to have had a lot of difficulty getting your heads around the blood spatter evidence and what it means. And some of you, in fact, have been very almost hung up about it. The fact is that blood spatter evidence that you got in the DNA week tells you where Mr. and Mrs. Ward were in the sense of their physical location relative to the car when they were shot. And the answer is inside it. Mr. Ward was sitting in the driver's seat and he was shot up here in his upper left arm. and Mrs. Ward was sitting in the passenger seat and shot in the right temple. Where they were, whether it was at the loch side or at the roadside, is not as specific as that, but the inevitable conclusion from the tyre marks and the footprints and where the gun was, and what we saw in the car at the roadside, is that those shootings took place at the loch side. And really, anything other than Mr. Ward sitting in the driver's seat and shooting himself like that would require contortions beyond any belief. So I think when you're looking at that part of your reconstruction, work comfortably on the basis that the shootings took place inside the car, they took place at the loch side, and they took place with those two people seated as I've just described to you. Now, I'm not saying any more than that. There are many variations on just exactly what happened when Mr. Ward was sitting there and Mrs. Ward was sitting in the passenger seat. But take that as where they were. Well, that's us. We've only got a couple of minutes to go, and Aidan wants to talk to you a little bit again about the feedback and the deadlines for next week. For myself, this is the last opportunity I'll get to see you, say face to face, so to speak. I think I've said a few times in posts, this is the second year that we've run this, and this class has been quite different from last year's. It's you've been a very well, I've enjoyed interacting with you all. Your comments and your questions have been terrific, really, really good. Even the ones who have maybe sort of shot off at a tangent a little bit, there's always been something behind it. And I think the alcohol and decriminalising drugs is a good example of that. And like I said today, I've done my best to steer you away from that because that's not what the module's about. But the points you were making, the questions you were asking there were good. And it's been terrific interacting with you. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you pay attention to the science that you're going to get next week. And I hope you do work your way through the logical process of working out and classifying the evidence and cast your verdict. And remember, if any of you are called up for jury duty and you don't want to do it, just tell the judge you took this class and you'll be excused right away.
Thank you, Dr. Tilson. To all those watching, we look forward to receiving your feedback. Don't forget you can use Twitter to contact us with any feedback and comments you may have regarding the course using the hashtag FLForensic. As pointed out by Dr. Tilson today, please remember to cast your vote by 1600 hours on Friday the 13th in the Week 6 poll. Do you find Mr. Ward guilty or do you find Mr. Ward not guilty? The choice is yours. We hope you'll enjoy the rest of Week 6. From everyone at the University of Strathclyde, thank you and goodbye.